Thank you, Ben. That was a lovely introduction. Yes, I'm here representing the growing autism community. And although autism isn't classically considered a mental health disorder, we honestly don't know what autism is yet. So one of the reasons Mike and I started talking many years ago was because I had a desire to redefine autism using new technology. And I'd always tell the story of chasing Mike Snyder after I read about him in the news when he'd been looking at his own genome, watching it religiously, got an RSV and watched his gene for type 2 diabetes turn on. His response was to double his exercise, I think, change your diet, and then he turned the gene off. I was always interested in actionability. So even in autism, where the numbers are now 1 in 22 in California, when my daughter was diagnosed, it was 1 in 5,000. And when my best friend's granddaughter was diagnosed recently, her doctor at San Diego, her son's doctor at San Diego, told them to do exactly what I was told to do 25 years ago. Nothing different, no different workups, no different assessments. So I started learning more about what Mike was doing, and I became very interested in looking at autism in a multi-omic longitudinal way. So that's why we started talking. So I've got 3 questions for you today to sort of take off from what you talked about in your presentation earlier. How can long and wide data capture help patient communities right now? And what can they expect to get back for all of this measurement?
Okay, well, I hope that long and wide data will be able to help subtype complex conditions. And to me, mental health, virtually all aspects of mental health are complex conditions. I can't think of a single one that's not. We don't diagnose them well, we don't subtype them well, and we don't treat them well, as came up earlier. And so to me, it's all about data. I think if we collect the right data, we should be able to figure out better what's going on. I'm not saying we'll get to the core fundamental understanding what's doing this, but I hope so. But minimally, we should be able to diagnose and subtype these conditions much better and then try to get the appropriate treatment. So to me, these chronic conditions are all just simple data problems. And people say, well, you need a lot of data, but we have a lot of people. Mm-hmm. We have 8 billion people on the planet. We have, I don't know how many autism can...
78 million.
78 million, there you go. That's a lot of people to collect data on. And even if we could just tap into 1% of that, mm-hmm. Well, you're talking 780,000 people that you collect data, try and see what's working, what's not, subtype. So to me, it's a simple data problem. And I think the sorts of things that we do, I hope will be beneficial there. Now, what can we hope the patients will learn? I don't want to overpromise. I don't want to guarantee anything, but it'd be awfully surprising if we couldn't diagnose these and subtype the different types of autism much better. Mm-hmm. So it seems like a logical outcome.
And as you can tell by Mike, there are many wearables that are currently available.
I forgot to ask, how many people here are wearing a wearable?
There we go.
Yeah, a little lower than I would have guessed, but all right.
And I have many on my daughter right now, thanks to Mike. So the idea is that even from an Apple Watch Sensomics watch, right now we can get data that tells us more about what's going on with our kid to help manage their care today than we've ever had before by putting a bunch of pluses and minuses in an ABA chart for kids with autism who have been only doing discrete trial therapy for decades. So all of this stuff is super promising. Second question, how will this kind of biological big data intersect with AI to help us better understand complex chronic diseases like autism and also to understand more about causality?
Well, for the first part, I think it's a no-brainer that we will all have personalized AI programs built around us. We'll all have sufficient data that we bring in that will actually, collect these different data types, make predictive models about what will, set off your stresses, set off your well, minimally they'll detect physical things like respiratory viruses that we already showed, but we know you can detect mental stress as well with a simple smartwatch. And that pulls in different kinds of data. I think the more different data types we get, the more precise we'll be. But the ultimate goal is to have predictive models of these things. And so it should be pretty trivial to build AI models around every single person, knowing what their baseline is, what kinds of things might trigger what sorts of things. An area that we're taking on that I think is quite fascinating. Autism is certainly one, but chronic fatigue syndrome, you may or may not know, if you over-exercise, you crash. It's called PM. And people don't know the different thresholds, and it probably varies from person to person, but you should be able to collect the right data to be able to train and build personalized AI models to get people optimized and hopefully improve their conditions over time too. So to me, that's a no-brainer. I hope we could do the same. We're trying to do that sort of stuff, as I say, for ME/CFS. I hope we can do it for autism as well. Again, but I think subtyping is going to be pretty critical.
Yeah.
There was a second part to your question that I forgot.
That second part was causality.
Oh, causality, yeah. I don't know. Right now we're operating more at the phenomenological level, so
Right.
I hope so. But I think as we track more, we may have to track for autism, the pregnant mom.
Yeah.
So I have to go back earlier would be my guess.
Or pre-pregnant mom.
Or pre-pregnant mom, yeah. So it'd be nice to track people before conception.
Right.
So anyway, you would try to follow that, try and then associate conditions with causality. And certainly there have been suggestions about certain,
Right.
medications and drugs pregnant women take that have led to autistic outcomes. So, and those are associations, but they lead to testable hypotheses. And so I would hope we'd be able to collect more of that and more on the preventative side then too. Like maybe you should be
Right.
eating certain things that would actually reduce the chances of this, or, exercise a certain amount. And there's certain things that we already know, at least for lifestyle now, for better managing glucose, that we should be doing now. Getting people to do it, that's another matter. But
Right. That's a behavioral thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak talked a long time ago when I had an interview with them before the Mac came out about everyone having an agent. You remember the idea of the agent? But this is truly a health agent idea. That is this concierge that can run alongside you and say, oh, today you may have a seizure because we're seeing this go up, we're seeing
these
this
days you might
change.
use the term digital twin, I guess.
Digital twin, yeah. Okay, I've been brought up to speed. Okay, and finally, how will these innovations help us understand autism? You just talked a little bit about that, but tell me about COUNT.
Yeah, so we're running a project. Elizabeth has been the spearhead of this. Some of you may know about it, where we're trying to do deep data profiles. It's in a pilot stage now. We're trying to roll 15 kids and basically collect as much data as you can around it. Uses some technologies I mentioned earlier. We do have wearables on the folks. We have, they're doing food logging. It's a fair amount of work, actually.
It's a lot of work.
It's almost
a huge amount
too much
of
work.
actually.
We had to back off a little bit.
We need more frictionlessness, and we're working.
So we are looking for more participants. So if you have someone you'd like to see enrolled, by all means do reach out. So we're doing this microsampling as a way of collecting. And I know pricking sounds like it hurts. It does on the fingertips. It actually doesn't hurt much there. So you can, it's a very easy way to collect blood for a class of individuals that probably doesn't want to show up in a doctor's
sensitive.
office.
Yeah.
So anyway, we think some of the technologies we built will be very powerful for profiling these. And then we're already seeing some interesting observations. I don't know how generalizable they are yet, where you'll see a drop in blood oxygen preceding an aggressive behavior from an autistic kid, at least in a few individuals. Now, whether that translates across is why we need more people to see if that's true. But to be honest, even if it doesn't translate across, even if it works for one child, we can build a personalized management understanding system. We think that would still be powerful, because at the end of the day, that's ultimately what you want to do. You want to solve that child.
Right.
It's sure we want to solve everybody on the planet, but you want to do it one child at a time. Right. And if it's your kid, you want it to be your kid first. So I think that's sort of what we'd like to see happen, build these personalized models with this kind of data. It's exploratory now, so don't get me wrong. It's a discovery-based project, meaning we're collecting information to try to see what's going on. And then from that information, we'll build at least diagnostic models, I hope, and management models and behavior modification models. Whether it leads us to causative understanding, I don't know. Again, you may have to go back to the pregnant mom.
Right.
And so we are doing some other studies where we're monitoring pregnancy, believe it or not, at this level, not quite at this level of detail. I wish it was at this level of detail.
Well, and we've been talking to all of us about their maternal, they want to do a maternal pediatric cohort. But COUNT Precision Autism Pilot is the first of its kind in the world.
Yep.
And it's definitely a redefinition of autism to not just be 6 out of 10 behaviors, and your kid gets slapped with that diagnosis and you go down the ABA train and maybe get other therapies. But there's certainly no way to measure, as Mike likes to say, you against you over time, understanding the biology that underlies the behaviors. So this is quite radical. And if you want to learn a whole lot more about what we're doing in our QC lab at my home with my daughter, we've been collecting data for a long time. It's an N of 1. Come to the track tomorrow. We're going to hear a massive amount and see our dashboard and learn from others who are also helping us to try to figure out how to manage Sophie. And we found out some startlingly amazing things, particularly about exercise and anxiety that we've been measuring. So yeah, we're going to be at Salesforce Tower all day tomorrow. So Mike won't be there, but we'll have lots of other interesting people. So please come. Questions?
Hello. Okay, I've got a mic to run it to anyone who's got a question.
How many of you have an autistic kid?
Yeah, raise your
Yeah.
hand. Thank you.
If I ask how many of you know of an autistic kid, probably everybody
Yeah.
raises their hand. Yeah. It's another one of these growing problems, and we don't understand why.
Yeah.
And it's crazy we don't understand why.
Are you also talking about people that are on the spectrum, say Asperger's, when you go from 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 22?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's so poorly defined. We call it a garbage can term.
So are
In
the
my world, it doesn't really mean anything.
Are things you're going to be looking to do to people that are high functioning versus not high functioning in the treatments?
All those things, all the labels for people are so difficult to deal with, because even what we're discovering now is some of the people who were considered high functioning are now in their late 20s, early 30s, and many of them are depressed. Some of them suicide, a large percentage suicidal ideation is huge. Now, we have no idea why. Teenage boys who've been doing well for some reason fall off a cliff and go into seizures, about 16, 17, horrible self-injurious behavior. There are all of these clues, but we're just gathering the behavioral information. We're not looking at biology.
The numbers changing just because we recognize sort of a bigger spectrum, or?
Yeah, Irva Hertz-Picciotto at UC Davis did a study on that long ago and said, no, this is not just better diagnosing. Talk to any teacher who's been in the system for a few decades and say, were there kids who couldn't speak and had 20-minute meltdowns in your classroom that you just didn't notice 10 years ago, 15 years ago? And they'll tell you. But the other test is just talk to anyone, anywhere. Our driver on the way here was saying, oh, my nephew has autism. It wasn't like that 25 years ago.
So do we know what we attribute that increase to?
Environment.
Pressures,
It's
social
not
pressures?
gene. Well, it's everything you were talking about. I definitely want to chat with you. It's an increasingly polluted environment. So the role that environmental stressors have on genetically vulnerable is the hypothesis that everybody's kind of running with now. So gene, environment, like all the rest of these.
And again, a lot of this may happen very early in development, so
Yeah.
it may be
We just don't know we just don't know.
the pregnant mom.
Oh, we have another question back there. Somebody pointing to you too. So.
Hi. So I've lived with autism, people who have autism, studying autism and so on, basically from birth. And what I would like to ask you guys, as you gather more data and identify how people profile differently on different dimensions and share that information with parents and the individuals with autism, how do you avoid over-pathologizing the person and just managing versus fostering their strengths and having a positive mindset about their identity?
Yeah, so the whole idea of fostering strengths becomes so silly when you have a kid who's having meltdowns 12 times a day or having seizures, many of them 20 times a day, or having diarrhea 10 times a day. So on the extreme end, where you've got the kids that are so out of balance when just surviving is the key, that thinking is misplaced in a way for those kids, but they're not being worked up biologically. The most seriously affected kids historically have not been worked up biologically. There's still no standardized assessment for working up a kid with autism. Catch them early, catch them at 2, and do a motor assessment to see if they have a motor problem, which would send them down a different track than going into ABA, which is extraordinarily successful and has been amazingly lucrative for people. It doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. There have been no long-term studies to say, does sticking a kid in ABA for 40 hours a week actually make the kid lead an independent life where they can speak? And so it's such a crazy thing to put all of these kids in the same bucket. If you have a kid who's socially a little bit awkward and has been classified as autistic because of social issues, what you just mentioned is perfectly appropriate for that kid, but I would still work them up. Because dynamically moving these kids through time, they can look great at 4. At 6, things are absolutely insane. I mean, talk to any parent here. You can go from 1 week to the next. So diet needs to be part of what we look at seriously. Just the environment around the kid, the stressors around the team of people working with a kid who bites you is, it needs to be considered when we look at the lifespan journey of these kids. But our push is to try to figure out what we can measure, how early we can measure that, and then to use AI and to look across all of these data sets that exist that are siloed about all the things that we have already been measuring in people with autism, but we can't share that. We've never shared that data. We've never shared those EEGs that are sitting in some data set at the Duffy Lab at Boston Children's. There are 10,000 EEGs. We can't look at those EEGs now for a whole host of reasons that don't make sense to me. We just had a meeting where we're looking at wearables for ultra-long EEG because epileptologists are saying we need to look at more than a 70. We need to look at. We're starting to be able to think about doing that with our kids. And if you have a kid who has drop seizures, no matter what, along with autism, you want to predict that seizure. 4 kids with autism and seizures have died this year that I know from drowning in hot tubs and bathtubs. And so we really need these alerts.
By the way, you can predict seizures from a smartwatch.
Yeah.
Not too long, 30 seconds, but that's better than
That's
nothing.
enough to get him out of a hot tub,
Right.
Hello.
I don't know if we have time for
Yeah.
one more question, or maybe just...
I just wanted to quickly go back to what you mentioned about pregnancy and kind of testing the pregnant women for things before getting pregnant. What are some things that you have found that are testable in pre-pregnancy or in pregnancy that could predict potentially the outcome of autism in your child?
Do you want me to answer that? I know a lot about
Well, we're doing a study on 100 pregnant women, not preconception, but the earliest time we can determine they're pregnant. And then they have an exposometer, which is a measuring airborne exposures. It captures all the biologicals and the chemicals that are in the air around the individual. And then we measure offline what those are. And so the hope would be to be able to associate adverse outcomes from that pregnancy with what exposures happened during the pregnancy. Now, that's a pilot study of 100 women. I have no idea what we're going to learn and find. Although it's kind of surprising, even from me, we could learn a lot about environmental factors that stimulate my inflammatory response. I don't know what it's doing to my mental health. I'll need George to help me assess that. But anyway, we may learn from 100 people that there is a lot of interesting stuff that'll come out. And I think if you do enough detailed measurements, even if they're not full-fledged clinical assessments, you might still see trends that would be very informative. So that's what we'll see anyway. We'll see what kinds of airborne chemicals and things. And you'd be surprised what around you can stimulate, do what to your metabolic profiles, your immune profiles, your microbiome. It's pretty cool.
And there are tests preconception. There are doctors who, if you're thinking about having a child and want to try to lower your chances of having a child with autism, there are definite protocols that people are using to try to do that. And I can talk to you about that offline.
Great, thank you. All right.
Thank you for the panel. This is more of a comment than a question in response to your great question about how self-knowledge for an autistic person can be helpful. It's humbling to hear that for very low-functioning kids that might be too aspirational, but as a parent of a very high-functioning autistic child, I can definitely affirm that having self-knowledge and understanding what neurodiversity is, understanding how it can be a superpower is very helpful. So from the young age of, age 6 to 10 to 15, they can go to a program like Social Thinking, Stevens Creek in the Bay Area. The Stanford School has a neurodiversity program for its students and its faculty that I think is really helpful in helping people with autism understand how they see the world and how their interactions affect other people and themselves, and really being able to harness the power of that and also learn to live with autism, kind of close that gap between how the world sees them and how they see themselves, to manage that anxiety and depression that can result if they don't have that kind of self-knowledge.
Elizabeth, I wonder, kind of piggybacking on that, if you can actually share some of the success stories that you've seen, especially with nonverbal children, et cetera. I know that for me was very eye-opening in terms of the possibilities.
Yeah, there are 30 million people with autism who can't speak. And so most of the time they're classified or have been classified traditionally as intellectually disabled, because all of the intelligence tests are all based on being able to be verbal, either answer a question, write a question, or point. And because speech is motor, they also have trouble pointing to the right answer, typing the right answer, writing the right answer. But there's a methodology called Spelling to Communicate, and the founder of that is one of the members of our Compass initiative. And she's done a remarkable job at training people to sit next to someone who can't speak and teach them to push a pencil through an alphabet stencil. And I know this sounds, when you know nothing about these kids, this sounds ridiculous. Well, just give them the thing and let them point to it. They cannot get their finger to do what their brain tells the finger to. They're telling them. So they call it the uncooperative body. So the kids that are taught this methodology and are able to start communicating eventually can type, and some of them are now learning to speak in their 30s. But having a kid that you meet for the first time at 11 is the way one mom described it, because you can't communicate with the child at all. And not being able to communicate means that the frustration level of these people is enormous. So it causes the meltdowns. You can imagine, it causes anxiety. Being considered retarded when you're not, would that be stressful for you through your entire educational experience? So just making people aware that these kids exist. We have a film from 2 of them tomorrow, a keynote that they did for one of our meetings. And it's just absolutely remarkable. And I just read another blog from a girl yesterday who's a non-speaker and a speller, that's what they call themselves, said, "Dare to believe in us." So when parents are told their kids are retarded, there's really nothing you can do. Imagine that for a minute. Take that in. When they're 2, which is what we were all told, all of us in the group, there's nothing you can do for your kid. Some of them were said, try to find a home, a group home. Well, there aren't any. There's nowhere to put these kids. To suddenly have your kid talk brilliantly about the things they've been learning all these years, literally by osmosis, without ever being taught anything, is profound, and a profound emotional experience. But the powers that be still don't accept spelling as real. So schools don't let you do it unless you're secretive about it. It's the stories around this are hard to believe unless you're in the space. But come and watch the film about the kids. And it's like my daughter now, she's a speller, and I'm teaching people how to work with kids so that they can spell. But she went to Mike Snyder's personal genomics course last summer. And she wrote a blog about it called How DNA Methylation Can Explain Mental Health Issues. Now, my daughter was kicked out of 5 schools, and I was told, why are you trying to teach her to read? She's, poor mom, silly mom. She's never going to learn how to do anything. If I would have listened to anyone in the school system, and I'm a tough customer, I'm not your average bear. If I'd listened to anyone, she would never have been able to write that blog. She really wants to study neuroscience. She still has seizures, she still has meltdowns. She still can't speak all that well. And she really wants to know what in the world is going on with my body, as most of them do. Why can't I speak? Why can't I stop moving? What caused this to happen to me? So even though there are those who think of autism as a superpower, I think autism is just a series of behaviors. Until we know what the underlying biology is for each kid, we can't do what Mike just said and be able to help all these individuals, many of them desperately struggling to survive from one day to the next, along with families that are doing the same. So,
Can you give the example that you shared with me about the boy who was locked into the facility and nonverbal? Maybe you can just share that, because one of the things that I found the most striking that you've shared with me is that this is really conditions that appear to be autism. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these people maybe don't have what we call autism.
Right.
They have heavy metal toxicity, they have gut issues, they have, who knows what else.
right.
Nutrient issues. So if you could just share that example.
Yeah, I think you're talking about Dylan, Ariel. So I've made several films about all of this over the years, and one of the young men that I met with early on that I was going to do an interview with was a non-speaker. And I went to his house with my crew to interview him, and when he came to the door, he was bouncing around, making weird sounds, flapping, no eye contact, no hello. He was 14 then. So kind of a big guy, but super skin, super thin, gray skin, dark circles under his eyes, so he didn't look healthy. And I asked the mom, I said, well, I'm going to interview him. How am I going to interview Dylan? And so they had a person come who worked with him on a device called a light writer, and she would hold his shoulder and he would point to the letters. And we did a 3-hour interview that was extraordinary. The whole crew was gobsmacked by this young man and how brilliant he was. Still not able to speak, not able to control his body. But I talked to his parents after. I said, he looks like a kid with gut issues to me. And so they took a leap of faith. This was probably 10 years ago. They flew him out of the state to be scoped, because it was illegal in California to be scoped. And I still have the movie of the pill cam that went down his gut filled with lesions. And so they did Chris, you'll relate to this, so they changed his diet. I think they did a little steroid, and then they went to more homeopathic remedies. So I came back 4 months later, and he had gained 40 pounds. He was a different color, he was pink, and he was speaking. And so I remember asking him at dinner, I said, so Dylan, what do you think? How are you doing? And he said, I didn't know what it was like not to be in pain. So he had diarrhea 10 times a day for 15 years, 14 years by that. And his doctor said, well, that's just toddler diarrhea. And they never did anything to try to help him. So he's gone on to do really well, but so is that autism? Probably not. That's probably some sort of gut issue that was mimicking because he couldn't speak. So still kind of like this, guys. Not a lot has really changed because they don't classically assess kids, work these kids up in the way that I'm describing. That's what we're trying to change.
Wow.
There's one.
That, by the way, that brought tears to my eyes, Elizabeth. I mean, it's really beautiful work that you're doing. And we're running a bit late here. But one more question. I know you've been waiting for a while. And then we'll go on a quick break. And I'm sure you can kind of sit up front and answer a bunch of questions during the break. So here.
Thank you so much. And Mike and Elizabeth, thank you so much for double-clicking into this topic. It's so important, and the story that you just shared really highlights the importance of discovering subtypes by investigating both long and wide data. My name is Greg Howard. I'm here as one of the co-founders of APOTH Health, and we're actually building a platform for multimodal and longitudinal mental health research.
Oh, great.
So I'm going to ask a little bit of a tangential question, but Mike, when you made this point about just requesting people who might be good participants in the study, I'm curious how you found your original participants, how you did that recruitment for the first 17, and more generally, how you find the right candidates for these studies.
It's hard.
In this case, I think it's through Elizabeth's networks how a lot of them signed up. But now we're funded by the Simons Foundation in part. And so they've just put out some notices. They have a fairly large network. So going through foundations, I said, for this kind of study, you need people who are really motivated. So you don't want people who are just going to, yeah, it sounds cool, and then drop off right away. It takes a lot of effort to enroll folks. So it does help if you have good contacts, no question, personal contacts. But otherwise, you go broader. We have all kinds of different studies running, and we use all kinds of different ways to try and recruit people. And of course, you also want to recruit a very diverse population as well. So getting yourself into certain communities so that you can broaden the kinds of individuals you're speaking with. At this stage, we're just trying, with the 15 people, it's, what works, what doesn't work. So when we roll this out much, much bigger, we can have a study that will keep people engaged, and then we'll certainly
give
work
them
harder
something
to
back.
get the whole world.
Yeah, 22 different assays. I mean, it's quite a rigorous study, and wearables and sensors, exposometers. Mike did a brilliant job. The group did a brilliant job putting it together. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Big round of applause.